to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. It's always a lot of fun to make this podcast, and particularly when I work with great guests. But this week was absolutely outstandingly entertaining because it was with two good friends of mine who I've known for a very long time, who are also RAF fast jet pilots. Air Marshal Greg Bagwell and Air Vice-Marshal Sean Bell, both of whom I've known for a very long time, all the way back to really early days, particularly with Greg. He was in flying training at very much the same time as me. He went down the Tornado route, flew the Tornado for a very long time as a very senior guy as well in the Air Force, ultimately reached a 3-star rank. So went up through all the various leadership levels, and now outside has been working in the defense sector, runs a bit of a portfolio business, and is the president of the Air and Space Power Association. Sean Bell, Harrier pilot, a little bit further behind us in the system, but not that much. A very experienced guy in terms of flying the Harrier. He went through the university route where Greg and I both joined straight from school. And he also went to all the way up to 2-star level, having commanded squadron, station, etc., as did Greg and I. And having left, is also in a portfolio career mode. Does a lot of work these days with Sky News. You may well see him on the TV quite regularly with Sky News talking about defence-related issues. He's frequently there. And because of that, both Greg and Sean have put together a thing called The High Ground, which is the Air and Space Power Association podcast, which is really good. It's got some great things on it, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, talking about contemporary issues around air and space power, then that's definitely something to listen to as well, because or watch, because they have a video version of it, and it's a really great show. And you won't be surprised, obviously, with the background of those two, that they've got some fantastic leadership thoughts and some great ideas, and therefore it was a really fun, lots of banter type podcast, but also with a lot of serious stuff in there as well, which I hope you'll find useful. So really hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed making it, because this one was a real laugh. So without further ado, off we go. Well, this week, what a privilege, joined by not one but two former RAF friends of mine and two different types of aviation men. One from the Harrier world, one from the Tornado world predominantly. So I'm going to have to just keep a tight rein on Sean Bell, because otherwise he'll dominate the podcast as the resident Harrier pilot here. But it's a real privilege to have you guys. I'm really glad you could join. You are both hosting your own podcasts for the Air Power or Air and Space Power Association, and I think that's going to be an interesting topic of our conversation, as well as the individual stories you've got. But welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob. It's always great. And we'll try and keep Greg's Tornado stories down to a minimum, because with the podcast, I already spend a lot of time with him hearing his stories, and
they're a bit longer because we didn't run out of fuel after about an hour.
Well, this is true.
You had somebody to talk to in the cockpit anyway, so why did you?
True.
Exactly, and that 2-person cockpit thing meant they could get their act together before they got back on the ground, so they could always have the stories better honed, I suppose, before we did that.
Always win the debrief.
Oh, and most important, yeah. Well, actually have a debrief. I mean, that's something I've talked about in the commercial setting an awful lot. Is one of the things I think that companies don't do. They just don't do that, and that's probably an area that's worth touching on a bit later on, because there's some good leadership stuff in all of that. But before we do that, let's just get into a bit of your background, because you both got massively impressive career backgrounds, and not least actually since you left the Air Force as well. But it'd be really interesting just in turn, just to to go through what you did, and then we'll do some of the stuff that I always do around early motivations and leadership styles and all those sorts of things. But Greg, do you want to just crack on and tell us a little bit about Greg Bagwell?
Yeah, it's funny when you say that. you don't think it's impressive to yourself. You just do what you do, don't you, and go through the motions. But when you look back,
Sean won't say that. He'll think it's very impressive.
there you go. And we're all of similar era. I mean, you and I were going through training at exactly the same time. So, went through training, flying training like many of us relatively quickly in those days. Straight onto the Tornado, which was quite a new aeroplane at the time, and nobody really knew what to expect. But thoroughly enjoyed it. We'll talk about that maybe a bit more. Did many tours on the Tornado, one exchange tour on the FA team with the Canadians, about the same time you were doing your exchange down the road with the Germans. And then as promotion begins to arrive, you have a choice to make, don't you? Stay in the cockpit or start to take on the wider leadership roles, which means flying a desk. Had a number of roles in various places, including one group, PGHQ, did a couple of tours there, quite fascinating with Iraq and Afghanistan dominating that period. And then finally my job as decom ops at Air Command, where I finally finished my career after 36 years.
Yeah, the most successful of the three of us, the 3-star officer amongst us here. So, no, you did a great job. Fantastic.
It's done on height. I'm pretty sure it's done on height.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, tall. You can't see that on the video if you're watching on the video, but Greg is a tall guy. Yeah, definitely so. And what about since you left? I mean, you've been pretty active since you left as well.
Yeah, went into the commercial sector as is many people's sort of calling, try and make some money, and but more importantly, I think try and put some of our knowledge back into the system that then helps it sort of do the right things. I know people don't always view it that way, but I certainly do. Worked for Cobham, which is quite a famous aerospace company. And still are with Cobham at the moment, but also have a couple of other jobs. One is the Space Power Association. And I'm also on the board at NATS, which is another entirely interesting world, looking at air traffic control in the commercial sector.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to that on the back of disruptions, various and stuff. That would be quite interesting to talk about that wider thing for sure in a bit. But no, that's terrific. So thanks ever so much. Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I started a little bit earlier actually because I never really wanted to join the Air Force. But at school, I did what was a test in advance at then Biggin Hill, and was very fortunate to be selected to get a flying scholarship. I had nothing to do with the Air Training Corps or anything like that. Got me 30 hours of flying. I had to sell my little motorbike at the time to get the extra 5 hours to get my PPL. And of course, my mother, I didn't have a driving license, and my mother had to drive me to the airport, and I took her flying in a light aircraft. Where I still wonder to this day how on earth she had the chutzpah to do that. But I got the bug then, and I went off to university, not because I found myself particularly academically gifted, but I played a lot of hockey, a bit of rugby, flew for hours and hours on the university air squadron system, got over 100 hours flying the Bulldog, and just got hooked. And that was the sort of catalyst for me for 3 decades in the Royal Air Force. I think, although I joined and it was the Cold War, we saw the last bits of the Cold War. But ever since that time, the last 3.5 decades, it's been sort of wars of choice. And most of us, I remember when I first joined, very few of the seniors had any medals. Whereas now you look at the kids that have been flying, particularly sport helicopters and stuff like that, they've got Kenny Everett style, massive amounts of medals. And I think that speaks to a whole operational experience that we enjoyed. I think it was interesting. I left about a decade ago, like Greg, you work out what you're going to do next, went into industry for a couple of years. But bluntly, I realized that I'd never done a day's work in my life in the military. It had been a vocation. I genuinely enjoyed it. It had good days, bad days, but I couldn't have honestly told you what I was earning on any particular day. Strap yourself into a jet, hair on fire, tearing around the skies, or on operations, and it was just a huge privilege. So I ended up leaving industry, doing what they call a portfolio career. Doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. About a third of my time running a little company, doing property development. About a third of my time doing charity work, president or chairman of all sorts of things. And then latterly, been doing firefighter work in the media because I'm a talking head for the Ministry of Defence. And like Greg, we get involved in a lot of things now, which is really designed that the MOD is not allowed to talk about this stuff. So we get wheeled out as grey-haired, knackered old farts who've been around the buoy a bit, can actually bring a little bit of common sense to a landscape which is often a pretty sensationalist and unhelpfully so.
Yeah, and we've seen you very regularly on Sky News. And I have to say, full credit to you. You've done a great job on that. It's good to see, despite the fact you're a Harrier pilot. Actually, it's quite good to see you've really
I love the
made
fact you've mentioned that 3 times already,
made a
and I
real
haven't had to
difference.
mention it. It's fantastic.
I know. Yeah, actually, you didn't even mention it in your intro either, which is amazing. So yeah,
All
and
I heard was knackered old fart whose mum used to take him to work. That's all I heard.
well, the other thing that I'd forgotten was that Sean's actually the clever one here, isn't he? Because he did go to university, whereas you and I, Greg, went straight in from school. But the flying scholarship thing amuses me because I did a test in advance as well, actually, in the days that they did that, and I failed it. I failed the aptitude, which you probably would say is not a surprise. But I was very active in the Air Cadets, and I got a flying scholarship, and exactly that, and a pilot's license before a driving license, and it's quite incredible, really, when you look back on it, isn't it? You could do that kind of stuff, and as you alluded to, Greg, I think the lucky thing for all of us was we were there in an era where the flying training system was relatively quick. It was the same sort of system, but you actually went rattling through it fairly fast, and you got to the front line pretty quickly. And you also, when you were on the front line, you did a lot of flying, which I think is one of the things that's a sad feature of the modern Air Force. I mean, okay, they get much more capable simulators and are able to do an awful lot of stuff in the simulator, but the actual physical amount of flying they do is clearly quite significantly different to us, which is a shame because without a doubt, it was a real feature of what we did, wasn't it?
Yeah, very true.
Well, it's interesting because why we mentioned that. I mean, the one time I pulled Greg up on this before, I remember one of my last days in the military. You alluded to the fact that I was 2, he was 3-star, so he was yes sir, no sir, 3. And I remember being on his carpet one day having a very heated conversation because there was the big trend in the Air Force to try and reduce flying hours and try and ramp up the use of simulators. And understandably, there was a view that the only reason we were doing that was to save money. It was the financiers trying to literally just whittle away. And of course, ultimately, there's no replacement for the fear, the adrenaline, the visceral sense of flying. You don't get quite that in a simulator. And I do think there was a really interesting debate which goes on to this day about what is the value of simulation. And there are some advocates that say, why would you ever need to fly? And I've always used the example of Top Gear. If you remember Jeremy Clarkson at the Luna Seca race circuit with the Honda NSX, and he could drive this thing around the circuit on his Xbox really quickly. But of course, when he put him on this track for real, he was nowhere near the time. And they said, well, is it because the simulation is rubbish? He said, no, it's because I can sit on my couch, pushing the back end of the car an inch away from the wall and not feel any fear. As soon as you're on the circuit itself and the car twitches, this fear that runs through your body. And I think that's the one balance. And I think we still are struggling as a service to work out where that balance lies.
No, I agree with that. I think the other aspect of difference is the G-force and the physical side of the flying, and particularly with modern airplanes. Having been lucky enough to fly the Typhoon at it was the very sort of final stage of my flying career. It's a really physical airplane. If you're going and doing combat in that, you're pulling 9G in it, and it'll at below about 10,000 feet, it'll sustain that. So that's a very, very physical activity, and you can't do that in a simulator at all. You don't get the G. It's bolted to the ground. The visual's very powerful, and it gives you all the kind of sensations. But that and the fear element, I agree, and the kind of level of risk, particularly with some of the kind of flying we were doing when we were trundling around at low level, was definitely a factor. I mean, Greg, you must have spent a chunk of time flying around at 0.6 at night in the Tornado. I mean, that had to be pretty interesting as well, I think.
Yeah, and you sometimes felt like you were in the simulator because you could just about see as much, especially when it was in cloud. But you had to remind yourself that there was quite a large piece of granite with your name on it not far away. I always said this, that when they bought in airbags for cars, it was the most dangerous thing they ever did. And what they should have done is put a 6-inch spike on all driving wheels, because that would have made people drive a lot more carefully. So I think there's a lot in this idea of the risk element, and therefore what risks you then take as an individual. Of course, we might get to this. We might be talking about machines making these decisions, and then we're in a whole different ballgame.
G is an interesting one. G is an interesting one, isn't it? I don't know, Greg, how much G did you routinely pull in a Tornado? Because I suspect, like us, the more G you pulled, the more you lost speed.
Yeah, about 3 or 4G. If you were pulling more than that, something had gone horribly wrong. It was straight line, fast speed.
I know a lot of people you end up talking to about this, then they talk about, because I've never flown like you have, Bob, the sort of a tour on these jets, but I've done a trip in a Typhoon, a trip in an F-16. I remember at the end of the F-16 trip, I said to the Dutch guy, he said, anything else you want to see? I said, 9G. And he went, oh, you Brits, you always want to feel 9G. And sure enough, he went up in a sort of death spiral. And yeah, you can do it, but it just hurts. And when you got down, you had this red rash on the underside of your arms and underside of your legs. Your heart had been displaced down your body. And you went, this can't be good for you. It was, yeah, you could stay awake because the jet manages to do a lot of stuff to keep you awake, but it's really unpleasant.
Yeah, it was particularly. I found with the Typhoon, I mean, the anti-G kit in the Typhoon, so full coverage anti-G trousers. You had a counter pressure vest that squeezed your body and positive pressure through your mask. When you're pulling more than about 7G, it would put oxygen into you under pressure, which made a huge difference. I mean, you in terms of your physical G tolerance. The bit that wasn't protected though were your arms, and particularly your left arm, because your right arm was on your leg, supporting, basically it was on the stick and supported on your leg. The left arm, where it was on the throttles, that I found particularly painful in my left elbow. Because obviously all the blood would drain down into your left elbow, and it would really be quite quite uncomfortable. And I guess they get used to it over time. The guys that are doing it all the time these days, but certainly was a very physical thing.
I think the G as well. Did you guys all go up a neck size or two as a result of
Yeah.
flying?
Yeah,
And
a
the problem
little
with that,
bit.
again,
Yeah.
people talk about, but I've got a pretty large head anyway, funny old thing, don't start. And 17-inch neck you went up to. But if you buy 17-inch shirts, they're like tents. They fit Greg rather than slim, sylph-like people like me. So yeah, it was a real sort
They're
of
called they're called biceps and six packs. Sure, that's what fills it out. At least that's what I think it is, anyway.
yeah, whatever,
So
whatever.
for those watching and listening to this, it was the day-to-day life in the Air Force across the forces. Tremendous amount of good-humored banter between all of us, which is one of the real features I think that was lovely actually about the service. I think that the one thing I miss, I don't know about you guys, the one thing I really miss is the people. And and the kind of atmosphere, the camaraderie, all the stuff that we had that went with that, because it was just terrific.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, that's what's so great about carrying on the podcasting world and staying involved in the associations that we all do is you keep that relationship going. Long may it continue.
It's also, I think it's one of the reasons both Greg and I get involved a lot with the sort of veteran stuff as well, because I think, Bob, have you interviewed Colin Bell on your
Yeah,
podcast
did a
as
great
well?
podcast with him, which was terrific.
And I just, people like that, 104 years old, very, very lucid, remembers all the experience he's had. I find it incredibly humbling that things we might grumble about, he did 50 missions over Germany, wasn't it? A whole load of them over Berlin, in a little ragtag Mosquito with a navigator, and he'd fall asleep on the way home and leave it up to the navigator to fly. And he wasn't quite confident that he'd get it back. But I just think it's really humbling and actually some of the banter you get, it endures, and it has endured for 100 years, and long may it continue.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, it's very interesting reading Guy Gibson's book, actually, Enemy Coast Ahead, which for anyone who's interested in aviation is a brilliant book, from that time, and it was written obviously before he was sadly killed later on in the war. But for a long time it was censored. So there's one out now that's the uncensored version, and there's a lot of stuff in there which anyone in the Air Force today would absolutely recognize, the kind of the hijinks and the behavior and all the rest of it, the sort of stuff that we just grew up with as well, which is part and parcel of being in that world. And it was just such fun to be part of it. And I totally agree with you. Long may it continue. It'd be a great shame if that ever dies out, because I think it is what makes it special. And to your point earlier, Sean, it was a way of life. I mean, it's not a job. I mean, I like you, I enjoyed every job I had. Very luckily in the service, I've know very, very few people who have spent their entire working lives out in the civilian world who can say that, and I think we're very fortunate as a result. I mean, just before we move off the airplanes thing, I mean, I think the other thing that is interesting is, I mean, Greg, you obviously saw the transition through the Tornado in, as it grew up, as it were, and from GR1 to GR4, etc., with all the different capability. I had the same with the Jaguar, where we clearly massively changed the airplane, and And we were in the MOD at the same sort of time, actually when we were doing the upgrade on the Jaguar, which clearly broke the mold in terms of the way we did that. Maybe we can talk more about procurement and stuff in a while. But I mean, Sean, you had it. You had that even more starkly with the change from Harrier, because you will have flown the original Harrier and then obviously onto GR79, and that must have been a huge jump, wasn't it, in terms of sort of a completely different aeroplane, basically.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you look back on it and think, so the GR3s were sort of, you strap them on and they were tiny and you sort of squeeze yourself in. There was nothing really in there. You just sat charging around with a jet with a bit of inertial navigation system that occasionally would tell you which county you were in, but that was about it. But I was never combat ready on that jet. I was the first of the GR5 courses, and the Harrier GR5 was this carbon fiber aircraft. It had got a bit plumper over the years. It wasn't quite as so it had reduced hovering performance, a lot more technology in it, but we didn't have any two-seaters. So all of a sudden they went, oh, how are we going to do this? Right, well, we'll get you flying on the old GR3 and charge around in that so you get an idea of what it feels like, because we do have a two-seater of that. And then we're going to send you to a simulator in America, because we don't have any simulators, so you get to learn what the GR5 is like. Then we'll strap you in the real GR5. You'll start it up, go onto the runway, accelerate to 100 miles an hour, slow down again, taxi in, and then we'll just let you loose in the aeroplane. And it was just really weird. I mean, it was great fun. It seemed to work, but it was a hugely risky time for the supervisors at the time. And yeah, there was always a duty pilot in the cockpit. There were lots of pigs, those sort of financial fines for when you left things in the wrong place or whatever. There were so many of those because I'd done my first tour as a creamie, as an instructor at Cranwell, so I knew the value of having two people in a cockpit. And you guys, well, certainly, Greg was most of his career with somebody else in, and I'd much prefer to go to war with somebody else there, because you've got more capacity than when you're on your own. But when you're on your own and you're in a brand new aeroplane, yeah, that certainly kept us awake at night a little bit, and certainly the supervisors, that was tough.
It's interesting looking at that, because when I was ASC one group course, we just started to bring in the F-35, and of course we didn't have two stickers, so we knew that we had to bring them in straight. First solo was your first trip, and therefore the simulators had to pick up the load. But actually, the automation in the F-35, particularly the Stovall version, it is so simple to do, and I've done it only in the simulator, to be fair, but it is so intuitive and so theoretically fault-free. That we can get away with it now. We just couldn't in the days when it really was, hand and eye and everything between your ears.
And that was so, even to the point where you pick up the point of with the F-35, it could hover just by pressing a button and it'll do it. Because the Harrier didn't have that facility, and you could only hover a Harrier when you were really lightweight, run out of fuel virtually, and therefore the pressure was mounting. You're watching the fuel gauge go down, you're struggling with this thing. So they gave you 6 hours of flying on a Gazelle helicopter up at Shawbury to try and get you used to what it feels like to hover and land and get that coordination. And none of the controls worked in the same way. But the great fun thing was you had 3 trips, 2 hours each. You'd sit yourself next to an instructor and just look at him and go, your checks, your problem, my fun. Can you get this thing started, my man? And they would get it started. You would take control. Off you'd go. And I remember one particular trip, which we'd all had a bit of a curry the night before. And so we were fine, but we were a little bit slow, and we'd had a load of coffee that morning. About an hour into the trip, most of us fast jet guys were used to about 45-minute to an hour bladder. So I didn't have a 2-hour bladder, and you could see me shifting uncomfortably. And he went, do you want to stop? And I went, can we? Just put it down in the field, got out, he had a smoke, I went for a wee, got back in, off we went again. It's a completely different world. So, but no, it was really interesting ways of innovation, just trying to find ways to help us that transition. Of course, once you've got experience, then you become an instructor on that aircraft. Now you know the mistakes, now you know the sort of challenges, and you're much better placed to look after the next generation.
Yeah, the simulator thing's interesting too, isn't it? Because the Jaguar, similar deal. We had a two-seater. You did quite a few two-seater rides when you went through the conversion unit. Having the simulator was, I mean, it was the cockpit was there, but in the old days, the visual for the simulator was hilarious because it was literally a physical model with a camera running around on it. And the worst thing that could ever happen was there was a spider on it or something like that, because it magnified everything hugely. So you'd be flying along and you'd come across, either a toy dinosaur that someone had put on there, or a big spider, which would look very big when you're flying along. But it didn't really prepare you. It wasn't like the aeroplane at all. So you couldn't, there's no way you could have just said, right, I'm going to jump in it. Not least because the aeroplane, certainly in its early stages, was very unforgiving. I mean, handling wise, it was very unforgiving, and also ergonomically, the cockpit was classically, people had taken a bucket of instruments, thrown them in there, and left them where they stuck. And so there was stuff in places that now you look back on it in terms of cockpit design, you think that is just crazy. And sadly, of course, it cost a lot of people their lives in the early days of the Harrier and the Jaguar, actually a single seat rushing around at low level. But I think jump forward to the Typhoon, where certainly when I was going through it, we did have two-seaters, and we obviously in fact, we only had two-seaters initially, and then we acquired some single-seaters while I was at the Station Command at Coningsby. And then we obviously did everything pretty much single seat quite quickly, because the airplane was so easy to fly and so forgiving that you didn't have those kind of worries. And now they don't do any two-seat stuff, even when there is a two-seater available. The first trip in the airplane is a single seat trip. And it's been that way for some time, which is testament to the kind of type of capability the airplanes offer these days, I think.
But it's also, I think, and we're swimming a lamp a bit here, but I do remember those early days, it wasn't carefree handling. You had to be really careful. And if you had fuel in the fuel tanks, there was certain G limits, certain rolling limits and stuff like that. You had to commit all of that to memory. And the challenge was, of course, you can't, you've no way of knowing how all that stuff gels together. Whereas now, and I remember flying in a Jag, my best man was a Jag guy. I remember flying the boot, and he was letting me fly a lot of it. And of course, I was naturally just putting a little touch of rudder in every now and again when I was doing a rapid roll. And he went absolutely apoplectic. And he said, "Leave the rudder alone. What are you doing?" Why? What's the thing? He said, "If you do that, we'll spin out of control." And, and you thought, oh, my goodness,
It's a footrest. It's a footrest, not a flying control.
And so use nose wheel steering on the ground, and a bit of rudder on the runway, but airborne, no, not so much. I mean, it's interesting. Again, when we all jumped in Typhoons, and obviously there was a real mix of people doing that, where having an airplane that was, because Tornado was fly by wire, but it wasn't the same carefree thing. I don't think, Greg, was it? With the Typhoon was you literally, we had, in the early days of it, we were experimenting, right? How extreme can we be, particularly doing combat and things like that, where it's, what can you do with the controls that, and find out what actually happens, which was just extraordinary. So because you could go effectively full pro spin controls, if you like, and the airplane would just go, well, I'm not going to spin you, but I'm going to give you the best performance I can give you, which was amazing.
Yeah, not just the handling either, the engines as well, where you could literally slam them from idle to whatever. But you used to be a bit more careful with the older engines.
No, absolutely right. I mean, the disadvantage, of course, with that kind of airplane as well was it was one of the things I had to do as the station commander at Coningsby was say to people who'd been used to flying around for years at low level, and me the same. I mean, I loved it. I absolutely loved the low flying. Was look, okay, we still need to do some low level for obvious reasons to go and do low level visual identification and those sorts of things, but actually you negate everything that's good about the airplane by being down at low level. Its radar's less effective, its missiles are less effective, it's using fuel like there's no tomorrow. It's incredibly powerful. You had a real challenge with keeping the speed under control. If you're flying around at low level, you often used to use auto throttle to try and manage that. But there was a really big shift. But Greg, you had the swingy wing thing. I mean, which must have been entertaining, not least in terms of, as Sean says, more limits than you know what to do with for every conceivable wing position and all that sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah, you're only allowed to use 3 of them officially. I won't say what was done unofficially, but officially, the one at the back, the 67 wing as it was for show. It wasn't really practical. It turned like nothing once you put them back there. The middle setting, 45 degrees, was for most flying above 300 knots. And if you were landing, taking off, or turning, you threw it forward. So yeah, it was pretty straightforward. You just got used to throwing an extra lever, but then Sean had loads of those.
Yeah, just move the shiny ones. Right? It was that was the banter, wasn't it? Right? If it's not shiny, then don't move it. It is funny though. I mean, I look at pictures of cockpits. And I was just doing it the other day for something, and looked at a picture of the old Jaguar GR1 cockpit, And you go, oh my God. Whereas now, I mean, glass cockpits and the simplicity of everything that's there, the ergonomic design of it, along with the airliner industry, it's the same thing, really. I mean, it's just transitioned the world completely in terms of the information it feeds you and how it does it. And it's really, really good to see, because apart from anything else, in the military context, or indeed in the civil context, I guess, it's just giving you, as the pilot or the crew, depending on what kind of airplane you're in, it's giving you so much more capacity to do stuff with the airplane, as opposed to have to worry about just flying the thing, which was clearly one of the things that we all had to do in the early days. And that's got a massive, massive step forward.
I think one of the things that, because I was a requirements manager on the F-35 for a couple of years, and I think, as you say, a good pilot, it wasn't about up, down, left, right, faster, slower. It was about situational awareness. And when you were scattered with it, most of the instruments I remember in the Harrier were, what's your oil temperature? What's your oil pressure? And frankly, you don't need to know what it is. What you need to have is a little light if it all goes wrong. And what you'll need is lots of stuff that sifts the data coming in and actually presents it to you in a manner that you can understand. And I was talking to somebody the other day, again, on a live set of Sky, you're listening to the producer telling you something while the interview's going on. And most of the correspondents will not have that because it's so distracting. Whereas all of us will have flown with a couple of different radio frequencies, different voices coming in. You're sifting it out, waiting for that little nugget that go, oh, that's for me. And I think that's the bit that when you're doing that and trying to sift everything else, the F-35 was all designed to make that as easy as possible, because it's not about flying the aeroplane. It's about generating that capacity so you can operate it effectively in a very complex world.
Yeah, I mean, Greg didn't have this problem, of course. He had someone to do all that while he just sat there and had a cup of coffee in the front for most of the trip.
I remember flying once. So it was an ex-Vulcan nav, and we got airborne. I'd not flown with him before. And as I put the gear up, he said from the back, he said, "How'd you take your tea?" he was joking, but for a second I wasn't sure. But yeah, it was different operating. I mean, I've flown two seat and single seat, predominantly two seat, and it can be harder, interestingly, because if you're not in sync and you're not thinking along exactly you spend all that time trying to explain to each other what you're trying to do and achieve, because each of you has control of different elements. Whereas when you're on your own, you just make the choice and get on with it. It could be a bad choice, of course, in which case it's not necessarily a good outcome. But yeah, two-seat flying actually did take quite a bit of effort to work up as a crew. So you begin to understand instinctively what you're doing.
How often did you fly as a constituted crew, though, Greg? I mean, were you, because for ops, I understood you tried to constitute, but obviously outside ops, you didn't.
No, you were constituted as crews generally. Even as a flight commander or boss, you'd pick your nav, or they pick you. And there was a navs union, so it was quite clear when they didn't like flying with somebody, they'd make that crystal clear, because ultimately, obviously, you had their lives in your hands. But yeah, you did try and fly constituted. Now, you were quite happy to jump around a bit, and if you're a supervisor and instructor, you'd obviously fly with anybody and everybody. But yeah, on ops, actually, you would try and fly constituted, because once you were working well as a team, you didn't want to break that team up, and you'd try and move heaven and earth to try and keep crews together.
Yeah, it makes an awful lot of sense. That, I mean, I was the other way around from you, Greg. Of course, my only two-seat tour was the one you've alluded to, which is my exchange tour with the Germans, and that was fascinating because the spec for that job was you had to be recce experienced, reconnaissance experienced, and not Phantom qualified. And I was going from the Jaguar on a recce squadron down to fly with the German Air Force on their recce F4s. And so I'd never flown two-seat, I'd never flown the Phantom. So I went and did about 25 hours on the UK Phantom, which was an air defense airplane, different engines, different avionics, different cockpit. I mean, a bit like your Harrier thing, Sean, with the helicopters and stuff, really. You kind of go, well, what's the value? I mean, there was some value in terms of the two-seat bit for sure, and the handling, because the airplane is a much bigger, physically bigger airplane than the Jaguar, and has some interesting kind of handling characteristics as well. But the fascinating thing for me with the two-seat thing with the German Air Force was, and you'll both laugh at this, because I'd been told before I went down, it was right, okay, Bob, go down, enjoy the tour, have fun, don't just keep your mouth shut, don't make waves and make a fuss about stuff. So I was keeping my nose clean, doing exactly that, and very much enjoying what I was doing on the squadron. I did the training group, and then I was on the squadron drifting along, and the boss got me in one day. And I'd been there probably 5 or 6 months, I suppose. And he said, "Hey, Bob, we want to tap into your experience and everything you've done before. So, we'd actually like to make you responsible for all the combat-ready workups of all the guys on that are coming onto the squadron." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm really flattered. Thanks very much. That's great. But a couple of minor things. One is probably it would be good if I was combat ready myself if I'm going to do that. And the other one is if you actually want me to do that with the pilots, I need some kind of formation leading qualification because I don't have that, and obviously I'm not backseat qualified on this airplane, so I can't fly with them." And so the next sortie, which was a singleton reconnaissance sortie, I became a combat ready pairs leader, which was was quite amusing. But then the bit that was even funnier about it was they had come from a background of very single seat focused as an Air Force. A lot of them were X-104 pilots in the early days, and so they were not used at all to flying with a backseater. And so I started saying, well, okay, if you're going to fly two seat, you've got to get the best you can out of the airplane, and you're not making any sensible use of it trying to fly it as a single seat with a guy in the back. And so I was starting to teach these guys things like, don't map crawl down the route, constantly giving me a commentary about where you're actually flying. We've got track, we know where we're going as wind corrected heading, we've got ground speed. So actually just, let's turn on to the next track. Let's go down that. Let's look out the window in 2 or 3 minutes and see where we are, because the inertial nav system was pretty poor. And this was like a revelationary thing for these, weapon system operators. They had never had any experience of that. And of course they'd do with that, and they thought it was terrific. Then they'd go and get in with a German pilot who'd immediately go, "What are you doing? Why are you doing it like that? You've got it. This is the way we do this." So it's, oh man, it was hard work to try and convert.
You're so right. I mean, it's interesting that flying the airplane in itself, I know it was a bit harder in the early days when airplanes were a bit more tough to operate, but nowadays it is about how you operate the aircraft, and the better operators can think further ahead and listen to more and more and take in more and more information, like all those extra calls, which in a war scenario is going to keep you alive. And therefore it's how you operate, not how you fly. Such a critical part these days.
Yeah, I agree completely. Actually, Sean, interestingly, on the Sky News thing, I years ago, and I was at Coltishall, we were doing ops over Bosnia, and I wasn't out in theatre at the time. I was doing just back at home, but they were doing a big piece around the siege of Sarajevo, and Sky News was doing a big thing about it, and we had a big kind of media circus on the base, and I did an interview live on the 12 o'clock news with Linda Doobly, who was one of the anchors at that stage on the news. And it was one of these down the line things. So I was talking straight to the camera, and you know the way it works, where you've got split screen if you're looking at it on the TV with RAF Coltishall on one side and Sky Studio on the other one. And they had said to me before the interview, said, right, our footprint covers former Yugoslavia, and we need you to be aware of this. And I said, no, it's fine. I've got Sky. I understand that, and I've done a few of these things before, so don't worry about it. And they said, we're not going to ask you anything controversial. It's all going to be very much, nice. We're in a nice piece about how the guys will be feeling and all that sort of stuff. And fair enough. So question 2 of what was supposed to be about a minute interview, which turned into 4.5 minutes, which, as you know, Sean, is quite a long time. It felt like a bloody lifetime, to be honest. The question 2 was, how are you going to avoid inflicting civilian casualties if you have to do bombing raids during the work that's going on around Sarajevo? And of course, all our media training is, if you get questions like that, you kind of, you just walk away and say, look, that's outside the scope of the interview. You can't do that on a live interview. You have to turn around and just respond to it. And exactly as you described, there was a load of yattering going on in my ear at the same time. So I'm having to manage that and think through all of that. And definitely the kind of what we do helped, because you were able to process the information, come up with something that was a vaguely sensible answer. At least I didn't get fired. So it must have been okay.
You're, like all pilots, though, Bob, you're a lot more comfortable being shot at than you are in front of a TV camera.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that is definitely true. It was
and who'd have thought as well that the initial banter of this, we'd have to shut the Harrier pilot up. In fact, we're going to have to shut the interviewer up.
Fair point. We talk. So let's go back to you guys personally, because I'm always interested in some of this personal stuff. I mean, your early motivations, Sean, you kind of talked about it, the start you got. Greg, what took you into the service? What was your kind of backstory for that?
Yeah, a mate of mine at school's dad was an airline pilot for BA, and I think I must have been about 14, 15, and going, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. And I think that the following year, BA shut down their cadetship scheme, which was it Hambleton? I forget where it was.
Yeah, Hamble.
Southampton. Yeah, Hamble, was it? So I thought, oh shit, I've come up with the idea of maybe flying. So right, well, I'll join the Air Force then, and joined the Air Cadets. Then did gliding at 16. Went West Malling Airfield in Kent. Went solo within a week after what was probably about, I don't know, 2 hours of flying total, because each trip was about 5 minutes long. At the age of 16, and then had the bug from there. Didn't then do much flying, did the odd little bit in Chipmunks, but then joined straight from school, because my A-level grades were not projected to be good enough to get me to university on a scholarship. So the Air Force agreed with me that I should join at the age of 18, and jumped straight into Jet Provost, and he was flying solo on jets literally at the age of 18. So similar to you, Bob.
I'd love to have seen you getting squeezed into a glider, because that must have been like trying to get a spider into a matchbox. Folding your arms and legs in and squeezing the lid down to try and get you in there.
It was easy for two reasons. One is you didn't wear a parachute, so that's probably somewhat counterintuitive these days. And secondly, it didn't have a canopy, so your head could stick out. So it wasn't a problem.
Kirby Cadet Mark IIIs. I did mine, mine at West Malling as well. Actually, same thing.
It was a bit harder getting in a Chipmunk. I couldn't wear the Mark I bone dome, the little silver bullet, so I had to wear the leather helmet with goggles. I really did look like an 18-year-old Battle of Britain pilot.
Yeah, you must have had that Harrier GR3 is pretty small though, isn't it, as well, Sean?
Yeah, in fact, because although I'm not nothing like as tall as Greg is, I'm sort of long body, short legs. So, you're in the GR3, you were a little bit scrunched up, and of course, it didn't matter at the time. You just get on with it. But the worry was, as you know, in the canopies, you often have this miniature detonating cord. So unlike the Top Gun, where it throws the canopy off, at most of our jets, there's detonating cord which explodes, and if your head is in contact with that when it explodes, it's not going to do your helmet any good. So, and during ejection, the last thing you want to be doing is putting your head down, because then it's going to squish you anyway, I think. Because did you eject, Bob? Because I know Greg and I both have.
No, that's when I have the same number of landings as takeoffs, or full stop landings as takeoffs, which is always a good. There's one tie I was quite happy not to have, to be honest. So, yeah, yours was a Harrier one, Sean? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the early days, they had Kapton wiring in the new GR5. We talked about it's a new jet, and it was, without getting highly technical, it just meant that they got a little carbon arcing, shorting going on it, and eventually this set fire to a big wiring loom just behind the seat in the engine bay. The irony was that in my flying career up to that point, I'd had, I think, 5 red fire warnings in the cockpit, not one of which was a real fire. And the one time my jet was actually on fire, melting through, I didn't have a fire warning light, but there was enough stuff that just stopped working, and eventually it was time to vacate the party and have a dinner party story for life.
Nice. Greg, what was yours?
Mine was a Hawk at Chivener, going through TAC weapons unit. I was on the range at Pembrey, and the engine blew up downwind. It literally had what was known as an LP stator blade failure. The whole engine just disappeared in one fell swoop. And I managed to PFL into Swansea Airport, which was always at the time. So if you've got a problem, go to Swansea. Whoever said that had not measured the length of the runway or its ability to absorb rain, because I landed in a 21-knot crosswind on a 4,000-foot runway. And as I hit I have witnesses that said I landed on the numbers. You can either believe me or not. And I thought, I am the boy. I have landed a real PFL or an FL, forced landing, and I'm going to walk away from this. And then I came out of the little dip at the end of the runway, and all I could see was trees. And as I hit the fence doing 70 knots, I decided I would part company with the aeroplane, which then trundled off into the woods and flew again for another 15 years until a naval officer killed it.
Wow. We needed a bit of repair work, I'm guessing, after it got into the woods.
It needed a new wing and a new engine and a new undercarriage, yeah.
Yeah. Did you? I mean, that's your testing the 0-0 capabilities of modern seats to the limits doing that. I mean, any after effects or?
No, surprisingly not. I mean, I can still visualize it even now if I shut my eyes. It was pretty dramatic, but quick for obvious reasons. I didn't have an awful lot of time to get ready to hit the ground. But I remember I was flown to Swansea Hospital for an X-ray, got back in a helicopter to get to Chivener, managed to get back in time for happy hour, told my story about 1 million times and drank not quite 1 million beers, but quite a few. Board of Inquiry on the Monday, they cleared me, flew again on the Tuesday, and went back on the Wednesday to finish the bombing detail that I'd been doing on the Friday. So it was all over quite quickly for me.
Wow. Yeah, that's seriously quick. What about you, Sean? Was yours pain-free at the end of it?
Well, it was slightly different. I mean, because my incident happened to 2.5 miles up, and so you were gliding, but the Harrier was never very good at gliding. And I think it was what Buzz Lightyear used to say was falling with style. And I don't know if you've ever done free fall parachuting, but the ground doesn't come up to meet you until about 5 or 6 thousand feet, and then you start to get this ground rush starting to happen. And it became evident then you're going to have to get out. And I think most of us flying, you're always paranoid that you get out and the jet would crash into a school or a built-up area. And it's not being brave; it's just literally being one of those things. So you keep driving it. North German plane was quite busy, so you know it's going to be fine. Jump out, fairly low. That's the only thing I got a hard time about afterwards. Board of Inquiry, did its bit and whatever. And I think the incident happened about 2.5 miles up, and I got out about 300 feet. But largely just to make sure the jet wasn't going to go anywhere. And of course, the seat's working; it works fine. But unlike Greg, so I got a bit of blood around, got a bit mashed up, but I was fine. Got back to the airfield, went into happy hour, started consuming my few beers. Suddenly the medics came rushing in and went, "We haven't done a blood test on you yet." Well, that's a bit of a waste of time now, isn't it? So sure enough, you went off, did a blood test. They'd stitched me up and a few other bits. But the back was the worry. Lower back, I had a bit of a sore lower back. And I remember the doctor, I won't mention his name, but I do still remember him well. I used to play squash with him regularly, and he wanted to inject my lower back with lots of dyes and things like that. And I went, I'm not comfortable with this sort of quackery going on around my back. And in the end, in the privacy of his office, he said, "Look, if you can still beat me at squash, then you're probably fit to fly a Harrier." So sure enough, the next day, lots of pills, painkillers, went on the court, thrashed his ass on the court, cleared me to fly. Off I went and flew again. But ever since then, I've had all sorts of lower back issues. So I'm not entirely sure that was that smart. But I think all of us, we just had a lust to get flying again, and we were given the chance to do it.
And to this day, that is the post-ejection medical test.
What, play a game of squash and see if
play a game
win.
of squash, beat the doctor, yeah. Find yourself a fat, unfit doctor, is my advice.
It is very funny how people respond in this. And again, it's something about the kind of way we are. I think I not having ejected myself, but obviously I know lots of people that have. One of the guys that did was my New Zealand exchange officer when I was in Commander 6 Squadron. And we had this horrible moment where he had a bad bird strike up near Lockerbie, actually, which was obviously the first thing we were going, please don't be anywhere near Lockerbie. But he ended up, jumping out of the airplane quite low, but was basically fine. But we didn't know that for a while. We had that very uncomfortable 15, 20 minutes where we knew we'd lost the jet and we hadn't heard from him and we weren't sure whether he was okay. But anyway, the next thing is he rang up the ops desk and his opening comment to me when I was talking to him, he said, "Hey, boss, I was due to pick up my wife from Norwich today. Can you just ring her up and tell her she'll have to get the bus?" And it's always stuck with me because it's such a ludicrous thing. You think you've just thrown away this airplane with all the trauma that goes with that and everything else. And that was kind of just cut through all of that, focus on the day.
I don't know if Sean's was the same, but the adrenaline was coursing through me for probably the first hour or so when I've seen photographs of me just after, and I looked pretty steely. And I remember comforting the fireman at Swansea Airport who had not seen airplanes crash through fences before. So I had to put my arm around him and see if he was all right. But there's then a picture of me a few hours later, and I look physically and mentally drained. So, but yeah, when your adrenaline is pumping, you can do all sorts. You're quite calm, cool, and collected.
It is interesting that so my boss at the time was a guy called Richie Thomas, an ex Red Arrows boss as well in the past, but I'd only jumped out about 7 or 8 miles away from Goodisloe, and I'd landed obviously because I'd jumped out fairly low, fairly close to the jet. And being diligent, I'd tied up my parachute, which meant that when a jet came across, they couldn't find me at all. A helicopter came and picked me up. But when I landed back at Goodisloe, my boss wasn't sure I was alive. And out from this helicopter bounced this steely killer of man, bleeding from his chest, huge grin on his face. And this guy was in tears, gave me a massive hug because he was just so pleased. As a squadron commander, in your later life, when you're then a squadron commander, you're paranoid about ever losing somebody, and he thought he'd lost somebody. But it ended well.
Yeah, that's a good thing, isn't it? Let's say outstanding. I do remember the story of Jaguar mid-air collision off Hull Beach Range with a tornado, actually, and the Jaguar went effectively sort of head-on collision, almost went down the engine intake of the Tornado, and Tornado didn't have any idea what had gone on, and just basically had essentially exploded. Crew got out, pilot got out of the Jaguar. They winched the Jaguar guy up first into the helicopter, and he's then sat there dripping wet. And then they winched the Tornado pilot up, who, as he comes over the sill of the helicopter, looks at this guy who he knows quite well. He goes, I didn't know you were on helicopters. That was just absolutely priceless, because there was just complete disassociation with what had just happened.
I heard a slightly different version. He said, "How long have you been on helicopters, mate?" And he said, "About 2 minutes."
Yeah. Well, same thing, but yeah,
I think he knew that the Tornado had hit him, but the Tornado didn't know what he'd hit. So I know the two individuals as well.
I thought you were going to tell a different story there, because one of my first experiences, I haven't got to the front line yet, but because I've been back as a creamie, but a Jaguar hit a Tornado down in the southeast of England somewhere. And I think the Tornado guys got out all right, but the Jag guy didn't. And he was a guy I went through initial officer training with. And it was our first experience of somebody dying in a flying accident. It was also a first experience. He'd been engaged. His fiancée wanted to view the body. And, there's all that conversation around that when, if you're thinking that pilot's going to have a little dribble of blood and that's not what you're going to see if you want to, but don't have that memory. And I think it served us well, because we all lived through a career where, I know on the front line we were losing 3 Harriers a year, 1 pilot a year, out of a fleet of only between 60 and 70 pilots. Whereas my son flies Typhoons today. He's never been to a funeral. He's never lost a mate at all. It's a very different world today than it was then.
Yeah, and I think it actually, interestingly, is a good segue into where I want to go into sort of leadership stuff in a minute, because I think that does present some interesting challenges in the world that the military is in today. Because when it does happen, and I remember on the Jaguar Force, we lost a guy who very unfortunately got airborne without the reheat in, tripped over the barrier, which was raised at the far end, and crashed and was killed. And it was the first fatality on the Jaguar Force for a very long time. And it sent absolute shockwaves through the force, and was really, really difficult for them to deal with. And I think the same thing happened at Coningsby it was 2 years ago now with BBMF, where Mark Long, obviously on the Typhoon, was flying a Spitfire on the BBMF, and was the first fatality BBMF, Battlebrit Memorial Flight, has ever had in its life. And obviously with all that went with that, with old historic aeroplanes and everything else. And it's the same thing, where it's really difficult. It's a really big leadership challenge for people to take people through that. And I think that's an ongoing problem for the service now, because you're just not used to that happening now.
Yeah, this gets used for other reasons, but resilience of the military and the nation, when you start facing a real existential threat, is what we're talking about here. And I think in the military, in our day, we were kind of used to handling that as a matter of routine in training. And had we shifted to a war scenario, I'd like to think we would have been far more equipped to just handle that and get on with it. But you never know how the human brain is going to react, of course. And I'm not advocating that we kill 1% of our entire military once a year just to get used to it. But it is something that this generation and the nation in this world that we live in now is going to have to come to terms with. Not because we all want to go through a war, but to be mentally prepped for it. You look at Ukraine. How did Ukraine shift from being what was, in theory, a sovereign country sitting there happy in peace, and suddenly shift to a complete war footing?
Yeah, and actually look at the Russian side of that, and just the level of kind of pain tolerance of losing the casualties on the scale they are. It's just extraordinary, frankly, that they could do that. Yeah. Bear in mind, we lost, 456, something like that, casualties in Afghanistan over 20 years, every one of which made the national news and this sort of thing. And they're losing more than that a bloody week.
So a day, I think, at times.
Yeah, completely extraordinary.
Yeah.
But hey, no, different tack. So leadership. The podcast, obviously, when we're not having lots of fast jet banter, which is great fun, I tend to talk a lot with my guests about leadership experiences, and you guys have got great leadership experience of lots of different things over lots of time. I'm just really interested in your kind of perspectives on how you've shifted your own styles a little bit and what you consider is important. What are the values that you think are the most important for leaders, not least in the kind of private sector world that we're all focused on today? Because I think it's one of the areas, one of the reasons I do what I do now is I tend to focus on the fact that a lot of corporates don't do much leadership development training, by design. They deliberately don't do it, and I think it's a shame. Because it means people are often, it's just by osmosis that they're getting there. But I think your perspectives would be really useful. Sean, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think there's often a perception in the military that you just order people about. You don't need to. Now, in the army, where you've got to send your troops to war and charge over, charge naked at Jerry, then clearly they've got to do what they're told. Our troops send the officers to war because we're the ones that fly the airplanes, and a very different model is required. I can only remember ordering people twice in my military career. Both of those times were on operations, and both those times were in public because the individual concerned was advising me that I was going to break the rules, and I was telling him I am prepared to break the rules. I take responsibility for that, and I'm therefore ordering you to do something to take the risk off their shoulders. But generally speaking, I think you look at what works for people that inspired you and what didn't work for people ahead of you. I was very fortunate. My first tour as an instructor, I was given the unique opportunity to be a flight commander when I was a creamie, which had never happened before. So suddenly I was leading the flight commander of a whole bunch of crusty old blokes who frankly looked at me and went, "Who the hell is this guy?" And I made a lot of mistakes, but my goodness, was it a great way to explore. And by the time I ended up getting promoted a flight commander and then onwards, it just felt a huge privilege. You just were ready for it. And for me, I think we can get into a whole load of things. For me, I think two things, one of which is I think you have role models that you look at and go, that's not me. I need to be something different. But I do think the service also invested in you. It recognized the value of leadership and followership. I remember a course I did in the US, and it was with a bunch of civilians. And at the end of the week, you're given a one-on-one debrief. And I remember it very clearly because they said to me, right, clearly you're a leader in the military, great job, very task orientated, great, you get on well, blah, 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 blah. And I went, yeah, I puffed my chest out. That's me. Then they went, your one big criticism, though, is that you probably don't realize that your style does leave some people disenfranchised. If they're not on the bus, they're off the bus, and therefore they're in the corners of the room. Some of them might be crying. And I went, yeah, but they've got to keep up. And he said, no, the worst bit of it is you won't even know they're there. And I remember now how painful that felt. And so what did I do about it? When I was station commander, I'm not a God-fearing man. I brought the padre in and said, I told him this story and said, if there are people, metaphorically, that I'm leaving in the corner of the room crying or disenfranchised because of my style, you need to come in here, have a cup of coffee with me, break it to me gently, but we do need to talk about it. And I do think sometimes individual styles, you can't be right for everybody. But I do think it's a lot of people confuse management and leadership in the outside world. And I'm a huge fan of the ability to inspire, the ability to generate that sense of camaraderie and teamwork. In my humble opinion, it moves mountains. We see it on the sports field, we see it in industry, and that was what we tended to try and focus our efforts on.
Yeah, a ton of great points in there. I totally agree with you about the misconception around military being authoritarian leadership constantly. It's one of the things I hear more often than anything else, really, and it's just wrong. Certainly, I think in the technical elements of any aspect of the services, in the Air Force, the Navy, and all the technical bits of the Army, it just doesn't have a place. Very, very rarely do you need to do that. If you're having to do that, as you say, it's an extremely unusual thing. Greg, what about you?
Yeah, I didn't try the divine intervention route that Sean did, but my journey is very similar to his, and you can almost look at it in phases. So very early on, as Sean says, and all three of us did, you sit in the cockpit, you do your job to the best of your ability, and the competition is fierce, and you're all trying to be the best you can be. So it's leading by example and just getting on and doing the job. So that's relatively straightforward. You're selected for that. The system that chooses you is kind of ekes you out from all the others to find that sort of character. But hopefully they found something a little bit hidden, probably to you, but a bit more transparent to them, which is that broader leadership style and ability to bring teams together, to take teams to the place they need to go together, as opposed to charging from the front and turning around to see who's following. And I think as time went on, I've had to adapt that and become more self-aware. And I think I'll be honest with you, I was still on that journey even when I left. Because that sort of natural heroic leadership style that we all kind of got brought up with, it sticks with you a little bit, and you kind of trying to break away from it is not easy. But as you start to take on bigger challenges, even as a station commander, it's probably the first time when someone comes up to you, you're worried about when the airplanes are going on operations or doing X, Y, Z. And actually the biggest problem you've got is the water main or your electrical system or the med center. And now you're having to deal with much more diverse problems with people that don't respond to charge, over the top, let's go. So your leadership style has to adapt. And in the commercial sector, I've found it even more so, because everyone's got their own motivations. They're quite rarely similar. I mean, militaries tend to operate with like-minded people. That is not true in the civilian world. Everyone's got their own agenda, their own mindset, their own goals. And pulling together teams are really quite diverse in outlook, not just in who they are, is a real challenge. And I think being self-aware is the critical bit. How am I coming across? How am I going to achieve what we're trying to achieve in the best possible way? Not here's my style, lump it or leave it, because that really doesn't work in the long term. And we've all got examples of good and bad. And I think, trying to cherry pick what you see as works. And if I went back and did it all over again, I'd probably do it quite differently. I'd like to think I'd do it better. But, I learned a lot on the way. And I think there are times when perhaps I wasn't as self-aware as I could have been about how I could have managed teams better and listen to more people, or at least give them their voice, and then allow everyone to see, what the right outcome was together, and then move forward as one.
Yeah, again, great points. I think the interesting thing, developing one of the things you were talking about there, when you become more senior, and I think it's true in any organization, but for us, when we were running stations would be a great example, or for you went on and did, it was as an Air Officer commanding, had a bigger kind of command remit within the Air Force. You cannot stay just focused on what you know a lot about. And for us, flying airplanes are very easy as a station commander to say, right, I'm going to focus on doing the operations thing. The reality is you've got all this other stuff which you don't actually know anything about, and you have to become more not only reliant on other people, but to be genuinely aware that it's no use trying to drill down and micromanage what's going on that you do know about. And again, I think that translates directly into the corporate world, where let it go. Empower other people, grow other people that are working for you, take the safety net away from them, let them be as you wanted to be when you were in those kind of roles. Because I think it's too easy to stay, I'm good at that. That's what got me promoted. That's why I'm an expert at this, and then stay attached to it.
Yeah. One bit of advice I used to give to anybody once they took on a new role and a new rank is don't be somebody different. Don't suddenly think you've got to move into a new, I've even seen people change their voice, I have to be more serious now or whatever. And as you can tell from me, I've always done a bit of a joke and taken a light touch, which sometimes goes the wrong way. But we select people on who they are. Trust who you are. Yes, you need to adapt, but don't change. That's not what we're looking for. But I think also I think we are better now at picking people who are more rounded. I think the Air Force that you and I knew, we had some seniors. Let's not mention names, who were pretty autocratic and certainly would not survive today. And I think we have got better. So I think the military has moved with the times. I think there's a point where you can go too far, because this resilience piece is important. That ultimately we are there for a very specific reason, and that requires sometimes some quite direct leadership. But yeah, don't change. You got promoted for who you are, not who we think you might become.
No, that's great advice. I totally agree.
I'd also pick up on that point with Greg, because I completely agree that we came up in a world where we were experts. I remember, at the time we joined, I think 100 people stood at the recruiting centre, or one would find their way into a fast jet cockpit. So there was an understandable sense of pride in what you do. But as soon as you're a stage commander, I remember, sitting around the room with the execs and realising after 3 months that they were all just asking me questions and wanted answers. And you sort of reflected back, and we had a little sort of day away. And I said, look, I'm not short of the ability to give you answers, but my job is to let you come out and tell me what you think needs to be done. My job is to make the ultimate decision. I'm no smarter than any of you. You've got far more experience than I have. The only difference is I'm the one who's held accountable for the decision at the end of the day. I'm the one who has to balance. Mr. Engineering guy may have a priority. Mr. Admin guy may have a different priority. The squadrons may have. How do you find that accommodation that is nuanced and focused on the priority? And I think, and you can only do that if people can talk to you. Those, as Greg says, we all know people who were more autocratic. You were scared of them. You never answered a question truthfully. You just literally stepped back. How on earth they were able to make informed decisions, goodness only knows. And I think that's a lesson that we all took forward from our careers into the rest of the time.
Yeah, I think sadly some of them didn't care. I don't think. They just basically went with it.
Yeah, well, that might be true. I think also in the military where hierarchies are very, very clear. I mean, we wear our rank literally on our shoulders. Everyone knows what the pecking order is, and quite often, everyone effectively operates within that pecking order. I think what I found since I've left, I mean, probably the most enjoyable and most challenging roles is as a non-exec on a board, because you have a certain role in leading as a board member and you carry a lot of responsibility. But as a non-exec, you're not trying to tell the executive team what to do. You're there to shape policy, strategy, and maybe help them when they've got decisions to make. And it's a very, very more challenging but more nuanced leadership role. And I think all of us as we go through life go on that journey, and you can only really learn the right ways of doing things at a certain time in your life when perhaps you are more self-aware and more able to sort of be mature and handle with your experience. But yeah, I found the non-exec function on boards really a fascinating place to be.
Really interesting. And I do agree with you. I think it's because it's just a different challenge. I mean, it's definitely trying to be that kind of wise counsel without meddling in the executive business. For sure, that's tricky some of the time. I always tend to talk about highs and lows with my guests, just because I think anybody on any leadership journey has had some of those. But what's the highest of the highs for each of you, Greg?
Blimey. I was hoping to do lows. I've got some easy ones. Those the high. It'll come to that, I'm sure. The highs. I think when you arrive, when you get through flying training and arrive on your first squadron, and you get combat ready, and you go, I'm here, I've made it, I've done it, I'm doing what I dreamt. And then you rapidly realize that someone asks you, well, what do you want to do next? I don't want to do anything next. So I'll just do this for the rest of my life. So that's definitely a high. Taking on your first squadron, being a squadron boss and realizing that you've got a team around you that is watching you, but also waiting for your guidance and working together. Same as a station and a group. So any of those key leadership roles where you take on, what we used to call your train set, but that was probably an unfair descriptor. But yeah, those times when you were given sort of very prominent responsibilities and then got tested, whether that be on operations or in a conflict or when a series, and that you came through it as a team, and you could all look at each other and go, yeah, we were ready for that and we dealt with it. So I think those are my highs.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've got very similar kind of view on the leadership roles, because the other challenge I found with all of those was the moment you set your sights on, let's say, becoming a squadron commander. Now you are one. You kind of, well, I mean, now I'm still, obviously I've got plenty of life left ahead of me. What's my next goal? And actually kind of adjusting your sights and then looking at where the next rung on the ladder was going to come from, that was going to continue to motivate you. Yeah, so totally get that. Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, Greg talked a bit about being command, and I think all of us, when we were squadron command, station command, like you, it's a massive career highlight. But I reflect on other things, that your experience, your expertise, and particular operations where you no longer follow the rules necessarily. It's more of your instinct, and you're held accountable. And let me give you an example of that. One of them was I was running the Expeditionary Air Wing at Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan. And that meant there were 4 Hercules, a few Harriers and the like. And the Hercules were moving freight around, but also getting the sick and injured back to the UK. Well, on a particular evening, the crews had all run out of hours. They'd all been busy all day. They're all knackered. We couldn't use the Hercules. But from Camp Bastion, 3 injured British servicemen were being evacuated, one of which was probably not going to make it back. The other 2 had injuries that if they weren't treated really soon back in the UK with specialist care, they weren't going to survive. And all of a sudden you're faced with, well, how do we get them back? There's not enough hours available. We can't, my authorization to extend the crew of the C-130 by a few hours, that wasn't going to even touch the sides. And if I asked back to the UK, I'd be asking them an impossible question. So I pulled out the squadron commander, and both of us were seasoned operators. We'd been used to that we knew where the risks were. And I just looked at him, he looked at me, and he said, well, the biggest risk here is that the crews fall asleep. Frankly, he said they'll be up for it, but they'll fall asleep. So we needed to find a way of keeping them entertained on the flight deck home. We worked out a couple of ways that might be able to be done. He was happy. He knew that the imperative was worth the risk. So I authorized it. The flight went back, and sure enough, the one guy who was going to die on the way back actually made it for about a week and therefore met his family. The other 2 made a recovery. They didn't pass away. Now, none of that stuff ever gets published. You couldn't ever tell the story afterwards because I'd probably be ripped to shreds by my lords and masters. But you sort of feel it was just a time and place and experience. And I think those moments in my career, for me, are most memorable. And the other one, I think, is always going to be meeting Colin Bell, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, DFC, who, we both of us have met and interviewed him, but 104 years old, veteran of the Second World War, mosquitoes, flying loads of missions over Germany, and just sitting with him, it's incredibly humbling that, we may be proud of what we did, but you look back to that vintage, not many of them left now. And that was a real highlight for me. And I continue to see the guy, and he continues to wow me with stories. And I just think it's a huge privilege to have been in the positions that we were, but also to be able to make the judgments based on experience and still have veterans like that to enrich our lives.
Yeah, I totally agree on both counts, actually. I mean, the age-old, rules are for the guidance of wise men and the blind obedience of fools. I mean, that is so true in the instance you're talking about there. I mean, I think that's we've all been in similar-ish positions, I guess, where we've had to bend them a bit, and I think that's absolutely fine. I mean, my approach generally has always been with this that if you're going to bend them, then make sure you're bending them the minimum amount, and and you're doing it consciously and sensibly and appropriately briefing and planning it, and doing it in that kind of way. And the Colin thing, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I just can't believe him.
Yeah, the rules thing is interesting, though. I look at the next generation. My son flies jets in the military today, and they're in many ways more professional than we ever were, but they absolutely slavishly follow the rules. And they've got a spy in the cab, the video that's recording them all the time. They don't break the weather limits and whatever. And you go, okay, how do you ever make that work in an operational environment, where things will happen and you need to be able to adapt quickly to them? And I do wonder whether that's available in the service in quite the way it was when you and I were serving.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think there's always a need to be flexible in the face of kind of really challenging situations. No, it's brilliant. Thanks very much. So sadly, Greg, to you're going to be welcoming this one then. For every high, there's a low somewhere. So what's the low point if you had to pick one?
Okay, if I've got to pick one, I'd say 2010. I was AOC1 Group. The defence review at the time had been pretty brutal. It effectively halved the combat air force in one fell swoop. And going up to Cottesmore to tell the Joint Harrier Force that for them the war was over. Then to the Tornado Force to tell them they were going to lose half the force. I think Jags were also on the chopping block in that same breath. And I think that's fine. That's part and parcel of life. You deal with those things. You're in the military to do what you're told to do. The government decide what the policy is, and you get on with it. What was the most difficult time for me then was the fact that the public presentation of that review was that everything was fine, and that we were going to cope with fewer numbers, we could do far more with less, and it was the disconnection, if you like, between what was actually happening to the people that were looking up at me going, well, why are you telling me this? None of that makes sense. and what they were hearing publicly. And I think that was the first time when I struggled with the idea of senior leadership in the military, and how you sometimes can't dovetail that with the political imperative at the time. And I saw other occasions when that happens, and even right up to the point that I left. But that 2010 moment for me was a real growing up moment of, wow, this is suddenly getting hard, because I'm now on point, and I'm having to say something to the team that I know if it gets out will get me in trouble, but it is the truth, and I owe them the truth. And I think the divorcing of what the political narrative was from the actual truth, that was probably my low point.
Yeah, I've had a few of those, and selling the Kool-Aid to people that you wouldn't drink yourself, was certainly one of the things that ultimately was part of my decision when I was going to go. But Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I was reflecting. I think, like Greg, there is a view, isn't there, that in wartime certain commanders prevail, but in peacetime they don't. And I think, Greg and I are sort of cut from the mold, where I certainly flourished on operations, where here's your training to get on, and the rule book doesn't have to be followed, but you are accountable. If you break the rules, do so with a full knowledge, and off you go. So I was a bit more sanguine about some of the Harrier decisions going or whatever. I think that it goes back to one. I remember the low point of my career, though, very clearly, was when Gulf War won. We talked about the Harrier. We were on the first Harrier GR5. We were brand new. You couldn't even deliver a 3 kilogram practice bomb properly. Tornado Force went off to war, and who was one of the first guys to get shot down? A guy called John Peters, who he and John Nichol, his nav. I've been through training with John Peters. I was godfather to his daughter, Tony. You guys will probably know well that he had struggled through training. He had not made it through to the front line. He'd spent a couple of years on the Domini. He determined to get back to the Tornado, and bless him, he had, but he hadn't had an easy ride of it. And here was him. I'd never really had any problems going through. Here was me stuck at Dechu Mamanu trying to work out how to deliver a 3 kilogram bomb fairly, whereas John Peters, who it felt to me, what was he doing in a war zone? First guy to get shot down, and now we weren't even sure he was alive. And I remember going back to my room in Dechi in tears and just really questioning what I was doing, why I was there. And I remember my flight commander came in, John, who he was an ex-Red Arrows, and we had a really long chat about it, because it wasn't about losing a mate. It just felt wrong. The whole situation felt wrong, and I felt that was, it stuck with me to this day.
Yeah, I did a podcast with John Peters, and he is really powerful, actually, because he talks in some detail about his experiences as a POW. And wow, I mean, I haven't had to put sort of warnings out on many of my podcasts, but I did on that one, because it's pretty emotional stuff, no question about it. I mean, I think, like most of us, actually, we watched them get captured, get paraded on TV, and thought, blimey, we're probably never going to see these guys again. And it was amazing that obviously they did come back from that. The Gulf War, similarly for me, actually, I mean, I was on exchange when the Gulf War happened. So with an Air Force that wanted absolutely nothing to do with it, and a government that wanted nothing to do with it. So it was pretty challenging, because the Jaguar Force obviously were very actively involved, and I was watching all my mates disappear off and go and do it. And I think for all of us, it's not about being warmongery. It's about that you've trained for years to do this stuff, right? And so when the boat sails, you kind of want to be on it, at that point, which was definitely a real frustration. That's quite a good sort of a segue, actually, with what you've just said, Greg, particularly about the kind of cuts and bits, to talk about where we are today. Because I think I mentioned at the front end, you are both doing a lot with the Air and Space Power Association. Greg, you're the president of it, and looking at what is going on in that space. Sean, you're obviously doing a lot of commentary on Sky News about all the kind of conflict stuff that's happening, and so you're really well versed in this. And I just blob the whole thing together with US politics, US dynamic around NATO, pressure to increase funding on NATO, pressure in the Air Force, in the I say the RAF, but more broader in the military, actually, around in the UK, about getting more strategic defense review that looks on the face of it like it's great, but then a world where we've gone from quite a positive narrative in the public domain very quickly to going back to, right, we're just going to talk about health and welfare. and maybe a bit of education, but defense has kind of dropped off the perch again a little bit. I'd just be interested in your perspectives around this, because I always try and talk, with guests about the areas they're most expert in, and this is clearly one for you.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I mean, firstly, it almost feels like it's gone full circle. So when you, I, and Sean joined, the Cold War, Russia or the Soviet Union was the threat. We were primed to meet that one single threat, and we were well primed. It was our singular focus. Are we now heading back to that world? Feels a bit like it. And it's a world that I don't think we're as well equipped today as we were then. We're not in the right places. We're not the right size. We don't have the right mentality. We probably haven't spent the right amount of money. And if America starts to get a bit wobbly and starts to be focused elsewhere, where does that leave the rest of NATO? Now, turning back to your point about, are people aware of the requirement for defence? As part of our work in the association, we get to speak to MPs relatively regularly. They are now hearing on doorsteps, am I safe from Russia? Not what you're doing with the NHS. So it is beginning to creep into the subconscious and the conscious awareness of people that this threat is real, and that you can't watch what's happening in Ukraine day in, day out for 3 years and ignore what is happening not that far away. And a lot of nations that are a lot closer to Russia than we are spending now quite large sums of money and spending it now to ensure that they're not next on the list. And I think it's not a time to panic, because NATO collectively, even without America, is still pretty capable. It will have to suck its thumbs a bit if America was to pull out significantly, because we know that leaves quite a large hole. But even so, European nations, if they pull together and do the right things under the NATO umbrella, are still more than a match for Russia. The question is, are we as nations a match for the Russian psyche and the way that Putin approaches problems? And I said this at a conference not long ago, attrition doesn't deter dictators. So the idea that we prepare for a war where we'll just keep grinding Russia down for years on end, I can tell you now, our Western democracies will give that up a long time before Russia will. So we got to do some really difficult thinking here, because in order to deter, you need to be ready to fight, and fight well on day one, such that Russia doesn't even begin to try its luck. And I worry at the moment that we're not there.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same space. I mean, Sean, I'll come to you in a sec, but I've often talked in a similar vein. I said, if you go back to Cold War times, you had a spectrum of defense that was from A to Z, and you had a very large chunk of that was conventional capability, and you had nuclear capability at the far end. And over decades now, we've atrophied all that conventional capability very significantly. You still got the nuclear capability, but there's a huge gap. And obviously the risk is that actually it's then a gamble, isn't it? Right. Well, they haven't really got much conventional capability, so let's take that on and see whether they're actually brave enough to go into the nuclear game, or stupid enough, whichever way you want to look at it. And I think that's a risk. It's definitely a concern factor. I was very interested on the war game that Sky did recently. That I thought was a really excellent 5 episodes of an hour each, that talked about exactly this kind of scenario. I thought it was fascinating, really well put together. It's
good stuff. And of course, you and I both started our career on the airborne nuclear deterrent.
Exactly.
Sitting in QRA from 15-minute readiness. Yeah, what goes around comes around, eh?
Yeah, no, you're right. Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there's 3 points. I mean, Greg's covered some of it anyway. I think we all joined us at the Cold War era. Lots of money being spent on defence. We were ready all the time, a bit like, you want your fire brigade. It's got to be ready all the time. Then for the last 35 years post-Cold War, we've been at readiness. In other words, in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be ready to go. Well, you can't have your fire brigade like that. They've got to be ready now. That's because we were fighting wars of choice, not wars of national survival. And we were basically taking on Iraq or Afghanistan or the Kurds, nobody who had a credible military capability. All of a sudden we get woken up by, I think it was Boris Johnson who said, we're not going to have tanks rolling across Europe anymore. And funny old thing, within a generation, they are. And we've now got to configure for, wars of national survival, and we're not ready. And there's so many areas of that. The second thing I think is we've lost the value of the word deterrence. And I don't just mean with a big D, I mean with a small d as well. Russia is busy waving a nuclear saber, and the whole of NATO, all of the European leaders back off. horribly. And you go, hang on a minute, you've got to stand toe to toe. That's the whole point of deterrence. Militarily, we're an order of magnitude more powerful than Russia is as a collective alliance, and yet we're allowing him to bully us. How did that ever happen? And the final thing I would note is that, because you goes full circle to how the public think about this. We are in a democracy, and one of the the least worst option, I think, as Churchill described it, because we're inherently short term. Our politicians want to get re-elected. There's going to be another general election in less than 4 years' time. There's not enough money in the coffer, and suddenly somebody says you need to double the amount of money you're spending on defence, and everybody's, where are we going to get that money from? Mm-hmm. And no politician wants to tackle that. So if they can play this long, they will do. The challenge, I think, is that the world will be spending more on defence, probably significantly. Air and space power will be a lion's share of that, because that's been seen to be the sort of the weapon of choice over the last few years. And therefore, if they genuinely want to make the UK, make defence the foundation of growth for the future, how are we going to do that? And I think there's a great opportunity to do that. But currently, I see no plan to actually do it. And I think the worry for me is, Greg and I were at the Global Air Chiefs conference, and the government, far from using that as an opportunity to create a vision of what the future looks like, in fact, we were trying to battle with a degree of censorship around, who could say anything at the conference. And certainly anybody in uniform was not allowed to speak in public. And I think that's a really worrying trend. There is nothing more important than the defence of the people of this country, and therefore we should be having a proper discussion about it.
I totally agree. I mean, just to drill down for 1 second on an aspect of that, I mean, when you look at Russia-Ukraine and you look at drone technology, what's actually happened in terms of their innovative approach. The Ukrainians in particular have been super innovative with this. And I just look at the Strategic Defence Review outcome, feels to me that we're still a bit very big platform centric. We're not necessarily being as innovative in our thinking. Now, I might be being unfair, but you guys are closer to this than me. I've stayed a little bit further away from it. What do you think?
On one level, you're right. And I sense that politicians today feel that too. And it's almost like it's a knee-jerk reaction. Oh my God, we should buy some cheap drones, otherwise we're irrelevant. The big danger with that is that that's buying into a way of warfare that has become the norm in Ukraine because air power hasn't dominated. And so you're almost playing into Russia's hand into fighting an attritional war. Now, I'm not for a minute dismissing their value of drones. I think they have a value. I think certainly in the very near battle space where you're talking kilometers, there's a question now is, will we ever stick an aeroplane in that space ever again? Because now drones can pretty much take on much of that function. But it does fall into the trap of fighting a war that Russia would be able to sustain for longer than we would. And that's something we need to think long and hard about. Now, the danger is the drones that we then start talking about are much more advanced, much more capable, can go a lot further and cause a lot more damage, similar to our manned platforms. But they're not cheap. And so the whole cost-benefit dynamic shifts completely. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think militaries have figured out the right mix yet. I think Ukraine has ended up where it has because of a lack of air power, and it's found a way to mitigate that, and a lack of artillery. It's found a way to mitigate it, and Russia's merely playing ball with them. Whereas we in the West, we need to think very carefully about how we deter. And is it with overwhelming force that can go very deep, strike very important targets, decisively, not just one fire on an oil refinery. You literally waste the oil refinery or the factory or whatever it might be. So I think we need to think very carefully about how we get this mix right. I don't think industry knows what the right answer is. A lot of players now, new companies coming along that are offering this, and they will be very good. And there will be occasions when drones replace manned aircraft or some of the weapons that we currently put on our airplanes for quite a lot of money. So it's not an anti-drone message, but let's be cautious here. Let's not chase what we think is the right answer just because it's working in Ukraine. If you look at how Israel used the drones in Iran, but used a mix of conventional air power too, as did, of course, America, that was a war that was finished, albeit in the Donald Trump 12 days, but it was decisive. And that would deter anyone else from thinking about taking on America or Israel in the same circumstance. I would argue the drones in Ukraine are clearly not deterring or winning against Russia.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sean?
Yeah, I sort of agree with that. I think one has to remember that the Ukraine war is a David versus Goliath. You know, Ukraine is a fraction of the size. It's got old Soviet kit. Everybody expected Ukraine to fall in a heartbeat. Russia's lost over 1 million troops so far, and if the Ukrainians were to get dragged into a war of attrition, they would have lost. Artillery shells being one thing normally cause most of the damage on the battlefield. Now, over 80% of the casualties are caused by drones, and they've caused a big sort of no-go area on the front line, which is very successfully for Ukraine stalled the Russian advance. But you're not going to win back territory by the use of drones. And I think when you've got a large land border, which you have between Ukraine and Russia, you're into a war of attrition. The war, as Greg rightly described, between Israel and Iran, there's no land border there. It's a distance. Therefore, air power comes into its own. And I think although we're an island, we've got this moat around us, and therefore it's a lot more difficult for people to attack on land. And I think therefore air power has a much more obviously. The only other thing I would say is that I was being interviewed the other day, and people were being very critical that we weren't buying loads of drones. There is a really interesting thing here that they reckon that every 2 years, the platform of the drone will be updated. There'll be a more battery technology, there'll be greater range, lighter, more technology. So why would you buy a load of platforms today which you don't necessarily use? You need to have a way of buying a lot of them if you need them. The technology that hangs on them is constantly evolving. And therefore, how do you plug in to the industry that are constantly evolving that? Not only the capability of offense, but also defense. There's lots of jamming going on. That's led to fiber optic drones. Then they're talking about EMP devices. It feels a bit more like the Cold War, where we did a counter. I think that level of technology, our own skunk works, is far more important to develop this capability than just filling up warehouses with drones that in 2 years' time will be useless.
Yeah, and I'll put my commercial head on just to add to that. I mean, turning that into a business model that allows small, medium enterprises to operate in that world is the challenge here, because Sean's absolutely right. Buying boxes of drones now that will be out of date in 2 years' time is pointless. But what you want to be able to do is produce thousands of them the minute you need them. And so coming up with an industrial model that both works in terms of capacity, but also works in terms of value for an industry to sit there in the wings waiting to be turned on in the event of a conflict. So, yeah, it's not as simple as just buying a bunch of stuff on Amazon and shoving a hand grenade in it.
Yeah, no, totally. Great answers. That's really, really helpful. If you've got time, just to finish off, there's two questions I always ask my guests, and I think you guys will have great answers to this as well. The first one is, what is the single most memorable event of your career? Greg.
Blimey. If I'm honest, seeing in my memory is probably my ejection. I mean, I've been shot at a few times, but they missed clearly. But ejecting out of an airplane is quite a traumatic experience. So I'd say, you know, if as I get older, my memory runs out, that'll be the last memory that will probably be the one that goes last.
Nice. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. The ejection definitely is one of those. But I have to say, the one I probably refer to most is one of the last things I did before I left the military was remember the Bomber Command Memorial that was opened on Hyde Park Corner. And it was a huge privilege to be there on the day. It was a warm day. I was in my number ones. There were guests from all over the world who were fairly ancient, were wearing their uniform, and we were going around handing out bottles of water and just chatting. And of course, you're there with your blues, your wings, your medals, all your finery. And I remember a couple of these old boys would, you know, as you approach them, they'd leap to their feet, stiffen their back up, tell you about their stories. And for about 3 or 4 minutes, they would be absolutely mesmerizing. Then you'd make their excuses because clearly they were tiring, and you'd start to walk away. And one of their family would walk up to you and say, "We've known him all his life. We've never heard those stories before." And I do wonder how many people of that generation went to their grave who never really wanted to talk about the war, went to their grave as heroes with so many stories. But those stories have no place in our society today. And I found that very moving, very hard. I still find myself choking up a bit even thinking about it now, because you just think there's a generation now that are gone. I wonder whether we really heard all of their stories.
It was really noticeable when I was lucky enough, as you know, to fly on the Battle Britain Memorial flight for a couple of years. And when we had there was still quite a lot of veterans then, 20 years ago. And the bomber command guys in particular were exactly as you say. They were very close. It was much harder to get stories out of them. And I think you're completely right. It's a real challenge. This is why I was so lucky to talk to Colin Bell, because he's got so many great memories. It was fantastic to have that opportunity.
Absolutely.
The last question to each of you then is, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked? Sean first this time.
Well, for me, this is relatively easy because I do so much media work these days, and it's anything about the war in Gaza. Because unlike anything else that we commentate on, the Ukraine war, naturally, we're arguing that Russia's been the aggressor. We're therefore sympathetic with Ukraine. We're part of a nation and an alliance that's sympathetic. As soon as you try and provide military commentary around the Gaza war, there's nobody else sat on the fence. You're either for us or you're against us, full stop. And as a military guy trying to commentate on what we expect to happen next, because you're not in one camp or the other, both the camps have a go at you. And therefore, before you even step into that arena, you're trying to provide a measured, objective perspective. How you do that, God only knows these days. But the amount of vitriol that follows on social media, any response you give in that space. So any question around that conflict is very difficult to answer.
Yeah, I can well imagine that. That's tricky. Greg, what about you?
Yeah, Sean's probably saved me by helping me to focus in on this one, because
I gave
I
you
think
some thinking time. I knew you were going to need that.
I needed it. I tell you, because I was going through all sorts of thoughts. But it's similar to Sean's, but it's less specific, and it's the question from the people that are underneath you when you're in a leadership role, who ask you, "Hey, boss, why are we here?" And trying to explain to them the political imperative, the military need, why the risks are worth taking. And there have been occasions when I've found that question extremely hard to answer. And I'm not going to mention them here, but you can imagine some of the places. And then other places where it's been really easy to explain. I remember when ISIS first appeared on the scene and we were deploying into Cyprus, I remember explaining to the team there, who were pretty fatigued and had just come out of Afghanistan and were literally on the way home, and suddenly had to redeploy to meet the ISIS threat. And it was an easy question to answer, because I had explained what the threat was, what they were seeking to do, and why the whole of the Middle East could collapse, and therefore what we were doing mattered. And yet I've been in operations where, at the time and subsequently, I've found it harder to explain the reason why we were there. But I think in the back of my mind, I was also calibrating the risks that we took, because if it wasn't a fight for national survival, then there's only so much risk you need to take. If it's not a matter of life or death for your people, then you can start to balance those risks. But yeah, that question of why are we here and what are we doing was probably the hardest one, and was asked more than once.
That I'll pick that up. Greg's given me thinking time, and I do remember I did sort of 3 tours, 2 years of my life in Afghanistan near the end, a year up in Kabul. And I remember as a senior guy flying backwards and forwards in some of our transport aircraft, generally speaking, packed full of our injured young servicemen largely. And although we lost 454 servicemen, frankly, they were dead. We lost a hell of a lot, lost arms and legs. And when you're in the back of those aircraft, packed full of these young men, largely in dreadful condition, and you were asking yourself that question. When we first went in there, following George W., 9/11, yeah, we're going to kick some butt. Many years later, we'd sort of transitioned into a nation building. It was not entirely quite as clear what that was all about. And yeah, I found that whole episode very, very difficult.
Yeah, we could have a whole separate conversation about a lot of this stuff. Indeed, we could have a whole conversation about an awful lot of the things we've talked about. It's been terrific, guys. Thanks very much. I knew it'd be fun. And lots of banter at the start, but also some great serious stuff that we're covering in there as well. So I'm extremely grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
Loved it. Thanks,
Always
Paul.
welcome.
Take care. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a lot of fun making it, as I said at the beginning, and I think some great tips, some great ideas, some real interesting exposure to the careers of two fantastic fast jet operators, and who've gone on to have equally good careers outside the military as well. So, so much to take away from everything they said. If you did like it, then please share it. Please like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast on your channels. Do all the things that you can to boost it, to help other people get access to it, and make sure we're getting the maximum amount of traction that we can with everything that's there. I do recommend their podcast, the High Ground podcast, which is, as I say, is an Air and Space Power Association specific one. There are a few High Ground podcasts out there, so just have a look, make sure you've got the right one. I'll put the links in the show notes for this on both the podcast platform and on YouTube as well. And if you really get value from it, please do what I ask you to do, which is to think about giving me back some value for the value you get, and go to Patreon, either through the podcast channel you're on and support the show, or going direct to patreon.com/leading4life. And you'll find the opportunity there to help me out and buy me a cup of coffee if you like, and or bacon butty as well if you go for the high end of it. Per month, and just think about giving me back some of the value that hopefully you get from this as well, because that would be really, really appreciated. But either way, love having you on the show. Really grateful for your listening, and thanks ever so much, and more to come next week. Speak soon. Bye now.